Good morning. How are you? So I was just listening to Tom from Tencent, and so I'm just going to come up here and say me too, and then we'll take questions. I'm sure it's the same for many of you that are here. The other thing that's great about being up here is this clicker has two buttons, so you can't really mess it up. There's a go button and a stop button. So this slide is really, like many of the companies that are facing some of the challenges we're all facing, Microsoft IT is big. We're big in a different way than like Azure is big. Azure is big in data centers. They're big in transport. They have huge complexity. Microsoft IT is big in that we have locations all over the globe. We have users all over the globe. We have a variety of things that happen around the globe. We have things like IoT devices where 10,000 IoT devices will show up in one of our buildings because someone decided to create an IoT lab, and then we have to figure out how to deal with that. So what we deal with from a scale perspective is a little bit different than what a cloud provider would deal with from a scale perspective. Quality of service on voice, obviously we run Skype for Business, is a big part of what we try to do. And running our own products is a big part of what we try to do. So this is kind of the slide that, this is where we're trying to go. So we've had historically a very legacy approach to corporate networking. I think legacy is probably the best way to communicate how we've approached it. And for the last 3 years, we've tried to modernize our legacy, if that makes sense, where the infrastructure, because Microsoft is primarily a software company, the infrastructure to support those software engineers wasn't necessarily a focus of our investment as a company, particularly in IT. And so we had a very legacy network, and it was okay. It wasn't great, and we've had to modernize that. So if you can imagine, how many of you guys are still running ABG wireless in your buildings? We still have like 70 of those that we're trying to modernize. So now that we're getting close to being actually current, what we would consider current, we've had the opportunity to start thinking about things differently, which is far more exciting than trying to get modernized. And there's a bunch of animation here, so hopefully I won't go too far. So the first thing is security. Now, we went to our security team and we said, hey, we're actually going to not have a corporate network in any of our buildings anymore. And one of my peers in the security team threw his badge on the table. You can't do that. And I thought it's going to take us 6 months to convince these guys that this is actually a better way to go. As more and more workloads move to the cloud, the need for a corporate network in the building becomes less and less. Why is it that suddenly you're more secure because you're in one of our buildings than you were at the Starbucks on your way to work, or commuting into work, or at the hotel when you were traveling? Your workloads are still in the cloud. About 6 weeks later, not months, they came and asked me, how fast can we do it? So now we're 6 months behind. So people are starting to get on board with this idea of, we don't really need a corporate network in our office locations. Now, that's a huge cultural change for a company. It's a huge cultural change for how we have built up processes that secure our data and manage identity and control data loss prevention. But the company and the security teams within IT are becoming more and more interested in CorpNet becoming the IT data center, and the office locations are just on the internet. And so as we aggressively move workloads to Azure, we're going to start to aggressively move users to an internet-optimized path, rather than CMPLS networks back to pinch points and data centers, which then basically hairpin your traffic right back to the country you came from. We'll just put those users on the internet where they are locally. And we think there's also, not only does it improve our security, but we also think that it reduces our CMPLS costs pretty significantly, as we're not having to long haul traffic back to central locations. The other thing is around wireless first. So we did a study across all of our office locations, and about 70% of our wired ports are not being used on a daily basis. So if you think about that first slide, how many locations we had, and you think about how many wired devices are in those buildings, and how many wires were ran for those wired devices, and how much power and cooling is being used to power and cool those things, and the M&R costs, and so on, pulling 70% of those ports out makes good business sense for the company. So we're going after trying to get rid of some of the wired networking across our enterprise. Now, there are places where you still need it. There's games developers and there's engineers that still need a wire because they're moving larger amounts of traffic. But for the most part, wireless, as people have voted with their feet, they're on wireless. They're not choosing to use a wire anymore. They're mobile. And wireless first happens to align with Microsoft's company strategy around mobile and cloud. We talked a little bit about internet first. The big challenge there is how do we maintain quality of service in an internet-only connection across the internet? I think Gert's going to talk a little bit about some of our ideas there and how ODL can play in that space for us and help us out. And so I'll save that for Gert to cover. And then the final space is around automation. Our network has grown up over the last 20 years and has become, let's say it was a 1,000 square foot foundation, and we now have a 10,000 square foot house on it. You know, things just kind of got bolted on over time. It's not uncommon in a lot of companies, and we're trying to unwind a lot of that stuff so that we can have a simpler, smaller, more effective network that actually takes less people to manage, costs less money for the company to maintain, and allows us to be more agile in support of our business needs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gert, who's one of our architects, and he's going to walk you through a couple scenarios.
Thank you, Brent. So as Brent mentioned already, with these, with all our workloads kind of moving into the cloud or moving into Azure for like non-standard workloads, plus the fact that there are some like changing security requirements, it doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore to drop all the traffic on our corpnet, or there's no need anymore to do that. So I kind of, when we look at this, there is a possibility to drop everything on the internet, but that won't work for all the applications that we have on the network today. So there might be requirements like quality for voice, quality for video. There might be certain HBI information or high business intelligence information that we are not allowed, or it might be that it's impossible to decrypt or kind of to secure that information. So for those type of scenarios, we still would like to have a connection in those offices that are really mainly connected to the internet. So the default path is going to be that everything goes to the internet, and for those like exception scenarios, we will kind of have an intranet connection. Like Brent mentioned, it won't really be a corpnet connectivity. Like it doesn't really necessarily mean you have to be on an Active Directory domain joint machine or so, but it will be an intranet connection that we can control, that we can manage, that we can guarantee you the quality and the security that will be required for certain very specific applications. So it was mentioned before, the main reason is that if you look at quotes from Gartner, for example, they say that companies that go down this path will be able to save 50% or more on their WAN costs. Okay? So the idea is that in the data center or in the headquarters, it's probably for us, it's going to be obviously be in Azure. You'll have your Skype for Business services. They will talk southbound to an open daylight controller. And then at the edge of your remote offices, there will be a decision point. I kept it very generic as decision point, but the next slide I will go into a little bit more details what exactly we think that, well, what we think that can look, and there are still a few ways to look at that. So classifying the traffic can be done in a number of different ways and has been done in a number of different ways in the past. So in the very early days, we just used GPO markings, right? If you, and I go back to the Skype for Business use case, but that's the first thing we're trying to address with Open Daylight. It used to be you log on to your system and you get some GPO policy that tells you to mark voice as DSCP 46. So you get a high priority over your network. Now, that works fine with the PC from the secretary. Then a company with probably 220,000 engineers, that's kind of complex to maintain. By the way, everybody is an administrator on their own machine, so if you look at those type of scenarios, we find traffic from any sort and any kind in our priority queues. So that doesn't really scale for us. The other possibility is what we did afterwards, that you just try to look at layer 4 markings. So we look at UDP port numbers that we use for voice and video for certain specific applications. That makes it better, but still it's not the most optimal solution. It improved the situation, but still we have a lot of, like I said before, we have a lot of very smart engineers. It's a large company, and they all know how to change the ports of the applications. I mean, lab owners, they know how to change the UDP port numbers for their tunnels between two sites. So they kind of write a voice queue all over the place. Now, lastly, the other thing that we did in the past, and we still do that today for wireless, we look at like deep packet inspection. We try to fingerprint certain applications, which works probably for 70–75% of the time. The problem is that everything goes to SSH, everything gets encrypted these days, and then also, if you look at Skype and any other like UC applications, they come with new codecs on the fly, and that breaks the whole setup, right? So the only way that we can really look at this is like if we have Skype for Business northbound, they can tell via the 5-tuple information, which is not very complex and which is an interface that is available today, they can talk to an SDN controller and explain them which flow is really going to be Skype voice, or which flow is going to be Skype video, and that needs that priority on our network. Right? So we will probably be looking at some of the, we might be just pick up the code that is available from Open Daylight, or we might be looking at some commercial releases based on the open source Open Daylight controller. Because it might be that certain partners have developed specific modules that are of use to us that we can just plug in and use. Well, hopefully they are open source then and not proprietary to that partner. But that's something that we haven't decided upon. The same for southbound. So as we want to do a first POC, we might just take an Open vSwitch and kind of plug it in front of our WAN router and use that to talk with OpenFlow to the SDN controller. And at that point in time, we can just we can be sure that all the DSCP markings will be correct, and we can, based on that, we can kind of steer the traffic or on the internet or on the intranet. Right? Obviously, the use case it's a very good example for an SD-WAN solution or for an SD-WAN controller. We're kind of a little bit hesitant to picking one because they are all proprietary solutions today. So they're not really open source, and we're kind of watching that space to see what's going to happen and see which direction we will go with that. Okay? And then obviously there's like wireless controllers, which is part of the Atrium Enterprise project, the second phase, but I think Bithika will talk about it a little bit more, where we will be looking at how can we take telemetry analytics and how can we relay that back to the information we can get out of Skype for Business. Okay, Bithika?
Thank you, Gert. So you heard about a few different initiatives and use cases from Microsoft. So I'm here as a representative of ONF, and how are we accomplishing that at ONF with open source software? So what you see in this slide is essentially Project Atrium Enterprise. It's codenamed Atrium Enterprise. But what it really is an open source reference SDN distribution. It's Open Daylight based, and it essentially integrates unified communications and collaboration as the application on top of it, and a variety of network elements on the southbound. So with the first use case that Gert and Brent described with Internet First, what we are delivering in this first phase is essentially a VNF, a virtual network function, with Open Daylight as the controller, and with Open Virtual Switch, OVS. So it's a very simple and easy piece of software that can be dropped into Microsoft Brownfield network. For the first trial, we're essentially looking at some satellite offices where we can drop this off for the trial. And what this is going to do is, imagine the Skype application. It's communicating the 5-tuple information to Open Daylight, which then tells that VNF that this is the Skype traffic, right? So that piece of software, that VNF, is going to sit on the edge of the building right behind your building router, and all the traffic that's leaving your building is going to hit that box. So that's where it will be able to identify this is Skype traffic, this is everything else. So the Skype traffic then gets routed to your corporate WAN, and the rest of the traffic gets offloaded into the internet. So we do have a session today afternoon at 3:05 p.m. that David Lenrow from Huawei is leading, and Gert and I will be there as well. So please come by to that session. We're essentially going to talk about how Skype is stocking intent into the Open Daylight controller. We are also going to talk about how we are architecting the whole scale-out architecture with Open Daylight, sort of in prep for the trial, and how we are planning to roll out the trial itself. So please come attend that session. We are in parallel exploring another option with SD-WAN. So I'm just curious, are there any SD-WAN vendors or developers in the audience? If I could have a quick show of hands. OK, 2. So we are looking at an option where we can have an SDN controller talk to the SD-WAN controller. So with SD-WAN, we still want to be able to do the WAN-specific optimizations and the telemetry and optimizations with the WAN piece. However, we, instead of doing DPI, like Gert talked about, we really want the application, like Skype coming in and telling through our unified policy abstractions, which in this case is offered by the network intent piece that Dave will talk about. But we want the application to communicate its requirements down into the network and into the SD-WAN controller, and then use that information to do the WAN level optimizations. So we're talking to a few SD-WAN vendors, but I think we really need help from the community, from SD-WAN developers in this space, to sort of work with open and standards-based APIs between SDN and SD-WAN to sort of make that happen on the WAN front. There is another piece here with respect to the Wireless First initiative that Brent talked about. So as part of Wireless First, what we're doing here is building 2 specific use cases that really come from IMTC. One is the automated quality of experience service, so things like dynamic quasi marking or access control. And the other piece is IMTC diagnostic service. So we're building these 2 services into Open Daylight, and then on the southbound, we are integrating that with using RESTconf with wireless controller. So that's sort of a phase 3 for Atrium. On this slide, the other thing that you see is a second controller, right? So you see ONAS. So where does ONAS really fit into this picture? So we are building a controller abstraction layer on top of Open Daylight and on ONAS. And typically, your UC application will be talking to that, to that API. And with Open Daylight and with the Atrium stack, that really is the enterprise part of the story. But ONAS really fits into the service provider part of the story. So we are also building an Atrium service provider piece, which really takes me into the next slide, where we are looking at a use case. We haven't really started the work, but we are looking at a use case where you can imagine Skype on the cloud. So there is a unified communications cloud, right? It's offering UC service down into the enterprise, but through 1 or more service providers in between that's providing the cloud connectivity from your UC down into the enterprise. So we are essentially looking at having an Atrium enterprise running and managing the enterprise network that's Open Daylight based, and then we are looking at an Atrium service provider that's ONAS based, that's sort of running and managing that service provider piece. But the beauty of this solution, and this really brings us into the 3rd use case that comes from IMTC, and this project is now part of one of the MEF use cases as well, is how do we really use the MEF, the LSO, the Live Services Orchestration APIs, and have something like Skype running on the cloud, communicate its requirements into the service provider cloud, into the enterprise cloud, so we can provide an end-to-end quality of experience and an end-to-end diagnostic service. So this is in the works, and we are going to talk about that more in an upcoming BOF session, as well as another MEF conference coming up in November. So why ONF? So this project is obviously kicked off at ONF by ONF Open Source SDN. And this really builds on the vision of ONF as to what they can do in this space to accelerate the adoption of SDN, well, in this case, enterprise specifically. But with Atrium, what we are really doing is a standards-based reference open source distribution that is easy to deploy and operate on Atrium partner hardware. And I want to stress on that point that it's an Atrium partner, so should be it should be easy for Atrium partners to come in and integrate their hardware and software on this stack. So that's how we're building the enterprise, so they can come in and build upon it as opposed to us completing the entire picture. And this entire stack, it's open source based. It's customer driven. We have a customer in front of us right now, and we're looking to recruit more enterprise customers who would want to trial and deploy this. It's deployable, it's interoperable, and pre-integrated. And so finally, with all of this, we want to build that minimally viable distribution that we can take it into operator trials and deployments. So I'm, I think, already almost out of time. But I just want to say that Gert and I will be in the afternoon session today, so we'll be able to take more questions there, but Brent won't be. So now is a good time to ask him any questions that you have related to Project Atrium or to Microsoft initiatives.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.